Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading The Amityville Horror by J. Anson. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back and relax, and enjoy the story. Tonight we are starting with Chapter 23, January 12th. George couldn't understand. Why did Kathy say he was yelling, "I'm coming apart"? He knew perfectly well what he had said was, "I'm coming unglued." Now he remembered he had been sitting in the chair when suddenly he felt a powerful grip lift up the chair with him in it and slowly turn him around. Powerless to move, George saw the hooded figure he had first seen in the living room fireplace, its blasted half-face glaring at him. The horribly disfigured features became clearer to George. "God help me," he screamed. Then he saw his own face emerge from beneath the white hood. It was torn in two. "I'm coming unglued," George yelled. Now, still groggy, he began to argue with Kathy. "I know what I said," he muttered. "Don't tell me what I said." The others backed off. "He's still asleep," Kathy thought, "and he's having a bad dream." "You're right, George," she said gently. "You didn't say that at all." She pulled his head to her breast. "Daddy," Missy broke in, "come in my room. Jody says he wants to talk to you." The urgency in his daughter's voice broke the spell. George snapped out of it and jumped up, almost bowling Kathy over. "Jody? Who's Jody?" "That's her friend," answered Kathy. "You know, I told you she makes up imaginary people. You can't see Jody." "Oh, yes, Mama," Missy protested. "I see him all the time. He's the biggest pig you ever saw." Then she trotted out of the room and was gone. George and Kathy looked at each other. "A pig?" he said. It struck them both at the same time. "The pig's in her room." George ran after Missy. "You stay here," he yelled at Kathy and the boys. Missy was just climbing on the bed when George stopped outside her bedroom door. He didn't see Jody or anything like a pig. "Where's this Jody?" he asked Missy. "He'll be right back," the little girl said, settling the covers around herself. "He had to go outside for a minute." George let out his breath. After the weird dream of the hooded figure, George had expected the worst when he heard the word pig. His neck felt stiff, and he rotated it, trying to work out the tight feeling. "It's all right," he yelled back at Kathy. "Jody's not here." "There he is, Daddy." George looked down at Missy. She was pointing to one of her windows. His eyes followed her finger, and he started. Staring at him through one of the panes were two fiery red eyes. No face, just the mean little eyes of a pig. "That's Jody," cried Missy. "He wants to come in." Something rushed past George on his left. It was Kathy, screaming in an unearthly voice. In the same move that it took her to reach the window, she picked up one of Missy's little chairs and swung it at the pair of eyes. Her blow shattered the window, and shards of glass flew back on top of her. There was an animal cry of pain, a loud squealing, and the eyes were gone. George rushed to what was left of the second-story window and looked out. He saw nothing below, but he still heard the squealing. It sounded as if it was headed for the boathouse. Then Kathy's crying whimper caught George's attention. He turned to his wife. Kathy's face was terrifying. Her eyes were wild and her mouth was tightly screwed up. She was trying to choke out words. Finally she blurted, "It's been here all the time. I wanted to kill it. I wanted to kill it." Then her whole body slumped. George caught his wife and silently picked her up. He carried Kathy into their bedroom, Danny and Chris following. Only Chris saw his little sister get out of bed, go to the smashed window, and wave. Missy turned away only when George called her to come into his bedroom. In the morning, while George and Kathy were still dozing in their chairs, the children asleep in the big bed, Father Mancuso bundled up and drove to Rockville Center. He shivered in the cold, nippy air. Father Mancuso hadn't been outside too often since winter started, and after the ride he felt a little giddy. He was grateful when the bishop's secretary offered him tea. The young priest had often spoken with Father Mancuso, and he admired the older priest's legalistic mind. They chatted until the bishop buzzed. The meeting was brief, all too short for what Father Mancuso had in mind. The prelate, a venerable, white-haired cleric, was a moralist of national reputation. He had the chancellor's file on the Lutz case on his desk, but to Father Mancuso's surprise, he viewed the report with reluctance and caution. The bishop was very firm about the priest's disassociating himself from the Lutzes and said he'd already assigned another cleric to pick up the investigation. Father Mancuso had nothing to say. "Possibly you should see a psychiatrist," the bishop continued. At that, Father Mancuso became upset. "I will if I may choose my own." The bishop read the displeasure in his visitor's manner, and his voice softened. "Look, Frank," he said, "I'm doing this for your benefit. You've become obsessed with the idea that demonic influence is involved. I get the impression that a good deal of it centers around you personally. That may or may not be." Standing up, the bishop walked around his desk to Father Mancuso's chair and put his hand on the priest's shoulder. "Let someone else pick up the burden," he said. "It's affecting your health. I've got too much for you to do here. I don't want to lose you. Do you understand, Father?" On Monday morning, Kathy was determined that Danny and Chris should go to school. Ready to fly apart herself, she stiffened her backbone and did her duty as a mother. While George slept on, she awakened the boys, fed them breakfast, and took all 3 children with her in the van. George was up when she returned with Missy. As she had coffee with him, Kathy realized he was still in a zombie-like state after the previous night's affair. For the moment, Kathy was determined to be strong for both of them. She talked to her husband in everyday terms, slipping in the reminder that he had to fix the smashed window in Missy's bedroom. Later, there would be time to deal with the decision of moving from 112 Ocean Avenue. Upstairs, George just nailed plywood over the shattered window frame to protect the room from damage by the weather, when Kathy called up from the kitchen that his office in Syosset wanted him on the telephone. The company's accountant reminded George that the IRS agent was due to come by at noon. Not wanting to leave the house, George asked the accountant to handle the tax situation himself, but the man refused. It was George's responsibility to determine how to pay the taxes. George hesitated, certain that something would happen if he left, but Kathy signaled that he should go. After he hung up, Kathy said that the appointment shouldn't take too long. She and Missy would be all right while he was gone. She would call a glazier in Amityville to drive over and fix the broken panes in Missy's window and throughout the house. Meekly, George nodded at his wife's advice, then left for Syosset. Neither had mentioned Jody's name. While Kathy was giving Missy her lunch, George Kokoris called. He was sorry he hadn't been able to get there as he'd promised George, but said he felt he'd picked up the flu in Buffalo. Kokoris's bout of illness had forced him to cancel all his appointments for the Psychic Research Institute. He was sure that he'd be fine by the following day, however, and planned to stay at the Lutzes Wednesday night. Kathy half listened to his explanation. She was watching Missy eat. The little girl seemed to be having a secret conversation with someone under the kitchen table. Every once in a while, Missy would extend her hand beneath the plastic tablecloth to offer her peanut butter and jelly sandwich. She didn't seem to be aware that her mother was watching her movements. From her position, Kathy could see there was nothing under the table, but she did want to ask her daughter about Jody. Finally, Kokoris was finished, and she hung up. "Missy," Kathy said, sitting down at the table, "is Jody the angel you told me about?" The little girl looked at her mother, confusion on her face. "You remember," Kathy continued, "you asked me if angels speak." Missy's eyes lit up. "Yes, Mama," she nodded. "Jody's an angel. He talks to me all the time." "I don't understand. You've seen pictures of angels. You saw the ones we had on the Christmas tree." Missy nodded again. "You said he's a pig. So how can you say he's an angel?" Missy's eyebrows grew together as she concentrated. "He says he is, Mama." She nodded her head several times. "He told me." "What does he say when he talks to you?" Again the little girl seemed confused. "You know what I mean, Missy," Kathy pressed her daughter. "Do you play games?" "Oh, no," Missy shook her head. "He tells me about the little boy who used to live in my room." She looked around to see if anybody was listening. "He died, Mama," she whispered. "The little boy got sick and he died." "I see," Kathy said. "What else did he tell you?" The little girl thought for a moment. "Last night he said I was going to live here forever, so I could play with the little boy." Horrified, Kathy put her hands to her mouth because she wanted to scream. George's session with the IRS had not gone well. The agent had disallowed deduction after deduction, and George's only hope lay in the appeal the agent said he could file. It was a temporary reprieve, at least. After the man left, George called Kathy to say that he'd pick up the boys at school on his way home. When he arrived after 3, Kathy and Missy had their coats on. "Don't undress, George," she said. "We're leaving for my mother's right now." George and the 2 boys looked at her. "What happened?" he asked. "Jody told Missy he's an angel. That's what happened." She began to push the boys out the front door. "We're getting out of here." George held his hands up. "Wait a minute, will you? What do you mean, he's an angel?" Kathy looked down at her daughter. "Missy, tell your father what the pig said." The little girl nodded. "He said he's an angel, Daddy. He told me." George was about to ask his daughter another question when he was interrupted by loud barking from behind the house. "Harry!" he cried. "We forgot about Harry." When George and the others reached him, Harry was barking furiously at the boathouse and jerking up short every time he reached the end of his steel leash. "What's the matter, boy?" George said, patting the dog's neck. "Someone in the boathouse?" Harry twisted out of his grasp. "Don't go in there," Kathy yelled. "Please, let's get out of here now." George hesitated, then bent down and snapped the leash off Harry's collar. The dog leaped forward with a savage snarl and ran out of his gate. The door to the boathouse was closed, and the best Harry could do was leap against it. Again he started his wild barking. George was all set to unlock the door and fling it open. Instead, Danny and Chris ran past him and leaped on Harry, wrestling the big dog away. "Don't let him go in there," Danny screamed. "He'll get killed." George grabbed Harry's collar and helped pull him down to a sitting position. "It's all right," Chris kept assuring the powerful, agitated animal. "It's all right, boy." But Harry would not be calmed. "Let's get him inside the house," George panted. "If he can't see the boathouse, he'll stop barking." As he and the boys were drawing Harry into the house, a van pulled into the driveway. George saw that it was a window repair man. He and Kathy looked at one another. "Oh, my God," Kathy said. "I forgot all about having called him." They hadn't reckoned on this kind of delay. His pudgy face and broad accent gave away his Slavic descent. "I figured you folks needed the fixing right away," he said. "What with the bad weather we've been having. Yeah," he continued as he opened his rear doors, "better to fix now. If everything inside get wet because of outside, it cost you more money." "Okay, that's fine," George said. "Come on in and I'll show you the windows that got busted." "The wind the other night, yeah?" the man asked. "Yeah, the wind," George answered. It was almost 6 p.m. before the man was done. When the new window panes were scraped free of putty, he stepped back to admire his work. "I'm sorry," he said to George. "I could not fix window in little girl's room. You need carpenter there first." He gathered up his tools. "You get him, then I come back, yeah?" "Yeah," George nodded. "We'll get him, and you can come back." He reached into his pants pocket. "How much do I owe you?" No, the man protested. No money now. You neighbor. We send bill, okay?" "Okay," George said, relieved. His cash was very low at the moment. Somehow the Glazier's kindness and friendliness left its mark on their spirits that night. After he left, Kathy, who had been sitting in the kitchen with her coat on all the time he worked, suddenly got up and took it off. Without saying a word to George, she began to prepare supper. "I'm not too hungry," George said. "A grilled cheese sandwich would do just fine." Kathy took the hamburger meat for herself and the children. As she worked preparing the meal, she kept Danny and Chris with her in the kitchen, insisting they do their homework in the nook. Missy sat in the living room with George, watching television while he built up the fire. The Glazier had been just the reassurance they needed. After all, nothing had happened to him while he was in the playroom or the sewing room. The Lutzes realized that maybe their imaginations were too fired up, and they were panicking unnecessarily. All thought of abandoning their home had momentarily disappeared. Father Mancuso was an individual who despised bullies, be they man, animal, or the unknown. The priest felt that the force that had 112 Ocean Avenue in its grip was taking undue advantage of the fears of the Lutzes and of himself. Before he retired Tuesday night, Father Mancuso prayed that this evil force could somehow be reasoned with, that it should know what it was doing was totally insane. How could it derive pleasure from pain? He asked himself. The priest knew there was only one answer. It had to be demonic. Just to be on the safe side, George and Kathy decided the children should sleep in the master bedroom again. With Harry inside, down in the cellar, Danny, Chris, and Missy were put to bed. George and Kathy made themselves as comfortable as they could. Kathy stretched out on 2 chairs. George insisted he was all right with one. He told Kathy he planned to stay awake all night and sleep in the morning. At 3:15 a.m., George heard the marching band strike up downstairs. This time he did not go to investigate. He told himself it was all in his head, and when he went down there would be nothing to see. So he sat there, watching Kathy and the children, listening as the musicians paraded up and down his living room, horns and drums blasting away, loud enough to be heard half a mile away. All during the maddening performance, Kathy and the children did not waken. Finally, George must have dozed off in his chair because Kathy awoke to hear him screaming. He was yelling in 2 different tongues, languages she had never heard before. She ran to her husband's chair on the other side of the bed to shake him out of his dream. George began groaning, and when Kathy touched him, he cried out in another completely different voice, "It's in Chris's room! It's in Chris's room!" Chapter 24, January 13th. George was positive he wasn't dreaming. From his position, he was sure he could see clear up to the boys' bedroom on the 3rd floor. He had been watching a shadowy figure approach Chris's bed. He tried to rush to his sleeping son's side and grab him away from the menacing shape, but George couldn't get up from his chair. He was pinned to the seat by a firm hand on his shoulders. It was a struggle George knew he couldn't win. The shadow hovered over Chris. George, helpless, shouted, "It's in Chris's room!" No one heard him. "It's in Chris's room," he repeated. Then the pressure on his shoulders lifted, and George felt himself being pushed. His arms came free, and he could see Chris was out of bed, wrapped inside the dark shape. George swung his hands wildly about, again screaming, "It's in Chris's room!" He felt another violent push. "George!" His eyes snapped open. Kathy was leaning over him, pushing at his chest. "George!" she cried. "Wake up!" He leaped free of his chair. "It's got Chris!" he yelled. "I've got to get up there!" Kathy grabbed his arm. "No!" She was pulling him back. "You're dreaming. Chris is here." She pointed to their bed. The three children were under the covers. Awakened by George's shouting, they were now watching their parents. George was still agitated. "I wasn't dreaming, I tell you," he insisted. "I could see it, pick him up and—" "You couldn't have," Kathy interrupted. "He's been here in bed all the time." "No, Mama, I had to go to the bathroom before." Chris sat up. "You and Daddy were asleep." "I never heard you. Did you use my bathroom?" Kathy asked. The door was locked, so I went upstairs." George went to the bathroom. The door was locked. "Upstairs?" asked Kathy. "Yeah," Chris answered, "but I got scared." "Why?" his father asked. "Because I could look through the floor and see you, Daddy." The Lutzes remained awake for the rest of the night. Only Missy fell back to sleep. In the morning, George called Father Mancuso. Minutes before, Father Mancuso had come to a decision. His anguish over the Lutzes' children and their safety had overcome his fear. Feeling he had been a coward long enough, Father Mancuso was now resolved to return to the bishop and ask that he be allowed to continue communicating with George. He showered for the first time in days, then prepared to shave. As he was plugging in his electric razor, Father Mancuso gasped. Beneath his eyes were the same black circles he had first seen at his mother's. The telephone rang at that very moment. Even before he answered the telephone, the priest knew who was calling. "Yes, George?" he said. George was too preoccupied to notice that Father Mancuso had anticipated him. He announced that he and Kathy had decided to take the Chancellor's advice and leave 112 Ocean Avenue. They were going to his mother-in-law's until George could get some kind of investigation going. Too many incidents were beginning to involve the children, and George felt that if he delayed any longer, Danny, Chris, and Missy might be in frightful danger. The priest did not ask what kinds of incidents, nor did he mention the reappearance of the circles under his eyes. He readily agreed the children's welfare should be everyone's prime concern, and that George was right about going. "Let whatever's there have the place," he said. "Just go." Danny and Chris did not go to school in Amityville that morning. Kathy kept them home again because she wanted to pack as soon as possible. George said they'd leave as soon as he called the police to tell them the family would be away for a while. He also wanted them to have Mrs. Connor's telephone number in case of any emergency. But when he picked up the telephone to dial the police department, the line was dead. When her husband told Kathy the phone was out of order, she became extremely nervous. Hurriedly, she dressed the children and then, without taking a change of clothes, herded them out to the van. George brought Harry from the cellar and put him in the rear of the van. Then he went around the house and checked to make sure all the doors were locked. Finishing with the boathouse, George climbed behind the wheel of the van. He turned the ignition key, but the motor wouldn't turn over. "George?" Kathy's voice quivered. "What's wrong?" "Take it easy," he said. "We've got enough gas. Let me take a look under the hood." As he got out of the van, he looked up at the sky. The clouds had grown dark and menacing. George felt a cold wind picking up. By the time he lifted the hood, the first raindrops were hitting the windshield. George never got a good look at what could have caused the van to stall. A huge gust of wind blew in from the Amityville River in the back of the house, and the hood was slammed down. George had just leaped aside to avoid the falling metal when a lightning bolt struck behind the garage. The clap of thunder was almost instantaneous, and the clouds broke in a solid sheet of water that drenched George immediately. He ran for the front door and unlocked it. "Get in!" he shouted to his family in the van. Kathy and the children bolted for the open door, but by the time he managed to close it behind them, they were all soaking wet. "We're trapped," he thought to himself, not daring to voice the thought to Kathy. "It's not going to let us go." The rains and wind picked up in intensity, and by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Amityville was hit by another storm of hurricane strength. At 3, the electricity went out, but fortunately the heat remained in the house. George switched on the portable radio in the kitchen. The weather report said it was 20 degrees and that sleet was pelting all of Long Island. Since the radar showed an enormous low-pressure system covering the entire metropolitan area, the weathermen could not predict when the storm would subside. George dealt with Missy's broken window as best he could, shoving towels into the spaces where it hung away from the frame, then nailing an old blanket over the entire window. Before he had finished, his fresh, dry clothes were soaked again. In the kitchen, George looked at the thermometer that hung beside the back door. It read 80 degrees, and the house was getting uncomfortably warm. He knew that the electricity was off. The oil burner's thermostat wouldn't operate. But when George looked again at the thermometer, it was up to 85 degrees. To cool off the house, George had to have some fresh air. He inched open the windows on the enclosed porch, the only room that faced away from the storm's main onslaught. From the time the storm broke, it had remained dark outside, and even though it was daytime, Kathy had lit candles. At 4:30, it was as if the night had already settled over 112 Ocean Avenue. Every once in a while she would pick up the telephone to see if it was working again, but she really had little hope that it would be. The storm would prevent any repair crews from going out on call. The children weren't fazed at all by the darkness. They treated the whole affair as a holiday, noisily running up and down the staircase, playing hide and seek. Since the boys were much better at hiding themselves, Missy was usually it. Harry happily joined in the romping, finally irritating George to the point where he cuffed the dog with a newspaper. Harry ran off and hid behind Kathy. By 6 in the evening, the storm still hadn't slackened. It was as though all the water in the world was being dumped on top of 112 Ocean Avenue. And inside the house, the temperature was up to 90 degrees. George went to the basement to look at the oil burner. It was off, but it didn't matter. The heat continued to rise in all the rooms except Missy's. Desperate, he decided to make a final appeal to God. Holding a candle, George began going from room to room, asking the Lord to send away whoever didn't belong there. He felt mildly reassured when there was no sinister reaction to his prayers. After the playroom door had been damaged during the first storm, George had removed the lock. Now, as he approached the room to recite his appeal to God, he saw the green slime was back, leaking from the open hole in the door and oozing onto the floor of the hallway. George watched as a pool of jelly-like substance slowly wound its way toward the staircase. He pulled off the pine boards nailed across the door and threw it open, half expecting to find the room filled with the slimy material, but its only source seemed to be the empty lock hole in the door. George gathered some towels from the third-floor bathroom and stuffed them into the opening. The towels soon became saturated, but the jelly stopped flowing. He wiped up the slime that had accumulated in the hallway and had managed to flow down the steps. George had no intention of telling his wife about this latest discovery. All the time her husband was going through the house, Kathy sat by the telephone. She had tried opening the kitchen door a little to let some air in, but even when it was only slightly ajar, rainwater showered into the room. She began to doze from the oppressive heat. When George finally returned to the kitchen, she was almost fast asleep, resting her head on her arms on the breakfast table in the nook. Kathy was perspiring, the back of her neck damp to his touch. When he tried to waken her, she lifted her head slightly, mumbled something he couldn't understand, then let her forehead fall back on her arms. George had no need to check whether the rain and windstorm had let up. Torrents of water was still smashing against the house, and he somehow knew they wouldn't be allowed to leave. That night, he picked Kathy up in his arms and took her to their bedroom, noting the time on the kitchen clock. It was exactly 8 p.m. Finally, the 90-degree heat got to Danny, Chris, and Missy. Their running about the house most of the day had worn them out, so shortly after George had taken Kathy upstairs, they were ready for bed. George was surprised to find it was somewhat cooler in the boys' room on the third floor. He knew that hot air rises, and on the top floor it should have been well above 90. Missy sleepily climbed into bed beside Kathy, but refused to be covered with a sheet or a blanket. Before George went back downstairs, she and the boys were asleep. George and Harry were now all alone in the living room. For a change, the dog didn't seem to be about to fall asleep early, but watched his owner's every move. He, too, was suffering from the excessive heat. Whenever George rose from his chair to go into another room, Harry would not follow, but remained stretched out in the cool draft beneath the living room windows. George thought of running outside to the van to see if it would start. It was still standing in the driveway, and George knew its engine would probably be wet by now. But the real deterrent was George's suspicion that once he left, he might not be able to get back into the house. Something within him warned him that he'd never get the front or kitchen door open again. Suddenly, at 10 o'clock, the 90-degree heat began to break. Harry noticed it first. The dog stood, sniffed the air, then walked over to the unlit fireplace where George was sitting, and whimpered. His pathetic sounds broke his master's concentration on the van. George looked up and shivered. There was a definite drop in the house's temperature. A half-hour later, the thermometer read 60 degrees. George started for the basement to get some logs. Harry trotted along behind him to the cellar door, but would not descend the steps with George. He remained in the open doorway, constantly turning his head as if to see if someone was coming up behind him. George used his flashlight to search out every corner of the basement, but there were no signs of anything unusual. With several logs in his arms, George climbed back upstairs and tried the telephone in the kitchen. It was still dead. He was all set to relight the kindling wood in the fireplace when he thought he heard Missy crying. When he reached his bedroom, the little girl was shivering. He had forgotten to cover her when the house got chilly. Kathy, on her stomach, was sleeping like a drugged person, not moving or turning in bed. George also tucked blankets about his wife's cool body. When he finally went back down to the living room, George decided not to make a fire. He wanted to be free to stay near Kathy and the children. Tonight, he thought, I'd better be ready for anything. George put on Harry's long metal leash and took the dog up to the master bedroom. He left the door open, but knotted the leash so that Harry blocked the doorway completely. Then George kicked off his shoes and, without undressing, slid into bed beside Missy and Kathy. Rather than lie down, he sat up with his back resting against the headboard. At 1 o'clock, George felt he was freezing. Because of the noise of the raging storm outside, he knew there was no hope of heat in the house that night from the oil burner. He began to weep to himself about the sorry plight he and his family were in. He now realized he should have fled when Father Mancuso originally warned him. "Oh, God, help us," he moaned. Suddenly, Kathy lifted up her head. While he watched, she got off the bed and turned to look into the mirror on the wall. George saw in the candlelight that her eyes were open, but he knew she was still asleep. Kathy stared at her reflection for a moment, then turned away from the mirrored wall and started for the bedroom door. But she stopped when she came to an obstacle. Harry was fast asleep, stretched across the threshold, blocking her path. George leaped from the bed and seized his wife. Kathy looked at him with unseeing eyes. To George, she seemed to be in a trance. "Kathy," he cried, "wake up!" When George shook her, there was no response or reaction. Then her eyes closed. Kathy went limp in his arms, and gently he half pulled, half lifted her back to the bed. First he sat Kathy down, then straightened her legs so that she was laying flat. Her trance-like state seemed to affect her whole body. She was like a rag doll. George noted that Missy, in the middle of the bed, had slept through the whole episode, but then his attention was diverted by a movement in the doorway. He saw Harry struggle to his feet, shake violently, and then begin to retch. The dog threw up all over the floor, but kept gagging and trying to force out something that seemed stuck in his throat. Restricted by his leash, the poor dog was only twisting the chain more tightly about his writhing body. The odor of vomit caused George to gag too. He fled into the bathroom, gulped a mouthful of water, took a deep breath, and came out with towels from the rack. After he mopped up the floor, George untied Harry and set the dog free. Harry looked up at George, wagged his tail several times, then stretched himself out on the floor of the hallway, closing his eyes. "Well, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with you now," George whispered under his breath. He listened, but everything was quiet throughout the house. Much too quiet. In a few moments, George realized the storm had stopped. There was no rain, no wind. The stillness was so complete, it was as though someone had turned off running water in a sink. There was a vacuum of silence at 112 Ocean Avenue. With the storm gone, the temperature outside began to drop, and in a very short time the house became ice cold. George could feel the bedroom become even chillier than it had been. He still had all his clothes on when he slipped back beneath the covers. There was a noise above George's head. He looked up and listened. Something was scraping along the floor of the boys' bedroom. The noise became louder, and George could tell the movement was faster now. The boys' beds were sliding back and forth. George managed to throw off his covers, but he could not lift his body out of bed. There was no pressure as there had been before when he had sat in the bedroom chair. George just didn't have the strength to move. Now he heard the dresser drawers across his room begin to open and close. A candle was still on his nightstand, and he could make out the drawers rapidly sliding back and forth. One drawer would fly open, then another, then the first would bang shut. Tears of frustration and fear flooded George's eyes. Almost immediately after that, the voices began. He could hear them downstairs, but couldn't make out what was being said. He only knew that it sounded as if a lot of people were thronging on the first floor. George's head began to roll as he tried to reach over and touch Missy or Kathy. Then the marching band struck up downstairs, its music drowning out the unintelligible voices. George thought he must be in a madhouse. He could distinctly hear musicians parade around the entire first floor, and then their first steps as they began to mount the staircase. George was screaming now, but he heard no sounds coming from his throat. His body whipped back and forth on the bed, and he could feel the terrible strain on his neck muscles as he vainly tried to lift his head from the mattress. Finally, George gave up. He realized the mattress was soaking wet. The beds were banging around above George's head, and the dresser drawers in his room were flying back and forth as the band headed up the steps to the second floor. But that was not all. Despite all the noise, George now heard doors throughout the house beginning to slam back and forth. He saw the door to the bedroom swing wildly as though someone were yanking it open and then immediately slamming it shut. George could also see Harry lying outside in the hallway, completely undisturbed by the racket. Either that dog is drugged, George thought, or I'm the one who's going mad. A terrible, blinding flash of lightning lit up the bedroom. George heard the thunderbolt strike something close outside. Then there was a smashing blow that shook the entire house. The storm was back, with torrents of rain and wind lashing 112 Ocean Avenue from top to bottom. George lay there panting, his heart thumping loudly in his chest. He was waiting, knowing something else was about to happen. Then George let out a horrible, silent scream. Somebody was on the bed with him. He felt himself being stepped on. Strong, heavy feet struck his legs and body. George shut his eyes. He could feel the pain from the blows. Oh my God, he thought, they're hooves. It's an animal. George must have passed out from fright, because the next thing he remembers was the sight of Danny and Chris standing beside his bed. "Daddy, Daddy, wake up!" they were crying. "There's something in our room." He blinked his eyes. In a glance, he saw it was light outside. The storm had stopped. The dresser drawers were all open, and his two sons were pleading with him to get up. "Missy, Kathy!" George turned around to look at them. They were still next to him, both still sound asleep. He turned back to the boys, who were trying to pull him out of bed. "What's the matter?" he asked. "What's in your room?" "It's a monster!" Danny cried. He doesn't have any face." "It tried to grab us," Chris broke in, "but we ran away. Come on, Daddy, get up." George tried. He almost got his head off the mattress when he heard Harry bark furiously. George looked past the boys through the open doorway. The dog was standing in the hallway, snarling and growling at the staircase. Even though he was unleashed, Harry did not head for the stairs, but continued to crouch in the hallway, teeth bared, barking at something or someone George couldn't see from his position on the bed. With a tremendous burst of determination, George finally heaved his body off the mattress. He arose so suddenly that he crashed into Danny and Chris. Then he ran for the open door and looked up at the steps. On the top step stood a gigantic figure in white. George knew it was the hooded image Kathy had first glimpsed in the fireplace, and the being was pointing at him. George whirled and raced back into the bedroom, grabbing up Missy and shoved her into Danny's arms. "Take her outside," he shouted. "You go with them, Chris." Then he bent over Kathy and lifted her off the bed. "Hurry!" George yelled after the boys. Then he, too, ran from the room, Harry following him down the steps. On the first floor, George saw that the front door was open, hanging from its hinges again, torn away by some powerful force. Danny, Chris, and Missy ran outside. The little girl, just awakening, was squirming in her brother's arms. Not knowing where she was, she started to cry with fright. George ran for the van. He put Kathy on the front seat and then helped the children into the rear. Harry jumped in behind them, and he slammed the door on Kathy's side. George ran around to the other side of the vehicle, jumped in the driver's seat, and prayed. He jammed in the ignition key. The motor turned over immediately. Spraying wet gravel, George backed out of the driveway. When he hit the street, he skidded, spun the wheel, and stepped on the gas at the same time. The van teetered for a moment, then all four tires grabbed and smoke shot up from the rubber treads. In another instant, the van was tearing up Ocean Avenue. As he steered the van towards safety, George looked into the side view mirror. His house was fast disappearing from his sight. "Thank God," he muttered to himself. "I'll never see you again, you son of a bitch." It was 7 o'clock on the morning of January 14th, 1976, the 28th day the Lutzes had lived in 112 Ocean Avenue. Well, thank you for listening to this week's story. And next week, we'll be starting with Chapter 25. And it looks like we have about 20 more pages left in this book, so I think next week we'll be able to wrap it up. I know I'm anxious to wrap it up. If I were them, I wouldn't go anywhere near that house. Well, everybody, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. This is a holiday weekend, so be safe, and we will see you next weekend for the final episode